Hello and welcome to the CNBC Africa special. I'm Chris Bishop. Now today is a very important day for both Africa and the United Nations. It saw the first day at work for the first African head of the United Nations Global Compact. Her name is Sanda Ojiambo of Kenya, and today she will run the UN agency that was conceived 20 years ago in the third year of the reign of the late former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan. The United Nations Global Compact focuses on private business around the world, and this year it celebrates its 20th birthday. I have Sanda Ojiambo, a former Safaricom executive in Kenya, on the line to give us an insight on her plans for global and private business, and also, how was your first day in the job?
Thanks. Good morning, and thank you for having me on the show. It's certainly unprecedented times because I take office sitting here in Nairobi, Kenya, for what actually is a role that should be based in New York. And I think it's just a reflection of the very unique times that we're in. So today's my first day, actually. It's been a very interesting onboarding process because prior to this, June 15th and 16th, the UN Global Compact ran what is now the largest, I think, virtual gathering of business leaders, presidents of a couple of countries, as well as UN representatives. And we ran the Leaders Summit, which commemorated the 20th anniversary of UNGC. So that was great for me because it provided lots of insights and understandings into the remarkable work that the Global Compact has done. I kick off today, my first day, with reflections on the summit, taking in a lot of content from the speakers and from the participants, looking at how that will help shape my 100-day plan, obviously my priorities, team interactions, looking at rebuilding strategy because the current strategy expires in the year 2020. So it was a great onboarding because I had the opportunity to hear from an audience of close to 23,000 people, world and UN leaders, on the prospect and the promise of the Global Compact.
And you were making a speech last night before many others, including Angela Merkel and a whole host of powerful people. But you've come into this job in arguably the worst of times. I mean, even before COVID-19, global private business wasn't in great shape. What can you do to help in your time?
Yeah. So, you could look at this in two ways. It could be the worst of times, it could be the best of times, because it truly does provide to rebuild. And, even the theme of our summit was about rebuilding better, stronger, and together. So I think globally, the world has had an opportunity to pause. Business has come under scrutiny. A recently released survey by Edelman Trust also called into question CEOs' commitment to really putting customers first, and really how some companies were addressing the global COVID-19 pandemic. So, I choose to look at it in terms of where the opportunities lie for business, how we can relook at the opportunities around international cooperation, around rebuilding broken supply chains, around more inclusive business models, and really about growth that embraces the Sustainable Development Goals as a pathway for the future and for humanity.
And when it comes to private global business, as you probably see from Johannesburg to London to wherever, the talk is of bailouts, loans, albeit some interest-free loans here in Johannesburg. But do you think this is really the answer in the long term to the big problems we face?
I think there is no one singular answer. If I could reflect on our continent specifically, we're torn between parties that are destined towards saving lives and priorities around saving livelihoods. The collapse is happening in many ways. There's fragile health systems, there's also very fragile economic systems. And, in many developed countries, we see huge economic stimulus packages, as you have mentioned, that, will spur business and drive economies forward. Not all continents are built on economic growth that is driven by large corporates. Here in Africa, a large amount of the economy is driven by SMEs and informal sector. I think the question is, how do we ensure that economic stimulus packages are inclusive and get to where they really are needed to kickstart and spur the economy? Businesses and governments also need to look at this rebuilding process from a broader, more inclusive perspective to ensure that we can really get the economy up and running ground up. I think also the stimulus packages will also have to tie into building, regional and ultimately international cooperation, because a lot of our economies are driven by trade, either import or export. So there's I think, multiple layers of economic growth that are required. The stimulus is certainly a first part, but hopefully we will take a much longer term view to what post-COVID-19 recovery looks like.
Now, what the UN Global Compact that you'll be running is all about is laudable, whichever way you look at it, honouring human rights, protecting the environment, shunning child labour. But how much are you concerned that some of these high ideals could be lost in the current desperation that many companies face for survival?
And that is a very fair point. Statistics say that, a fair amount of businesses may never recover post-COVID. A fair amount of workers have been laid off. Livelihoods, income streams have been lost. I think it is now a question of careful balance and leadership that is reflective enough to take a very long-term view at what business means. And I think that is where the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact that you've mentioned, as well as Sustainable Development Goals, come to play. It's now about values-driven business. It's about purpose. Why does your business exist? We say that business is really here for societal transformation. And I think those businesses that were able to pivot during the COVID pandemic and deliver more for, solutions that were really destined towards addressing, humanity's needs are those that will have survived. Now, it's not you don't really wake up tomorrow and turn on the switch and are on a different path. I think this is, again, a moment to reset and to really think about what business means going forward. Within the Global Compact, we have taken some of these complex ideals and created metrics and indicators that we feel will provide a true guide to businesses in terms of integrating the Sustainable Development Goals and the 10 principles into their work. We've also been able to do some other practical initiatives, like looking at the Belt and Road initiative that's going on and indicating that there are targets that one can meet that deliver to the Sustainable Development Goals while implementing such large infrastructure projects. So I really think the opportunity lies to distill some of these ideals and demonstrate their relevance and practicality for business.
But another thing you must be grappling with as well is that, and you know as well as I, you've worked on this continent. I've worked up and down for 30 years covering business stories. But in terms of some of the transgressors in the things that you're trying to stamp out, they're often small companies that you probably don't even know about. What are you going to do about them?
Absolutely. So this is a global movement. We are a membership-based organization that has laid out, should I say, standards or ideals, principles for business, the 10 principles. Now, what we do is a continuous improvement process. We also require a report that's called a communication on progress, where companies will report against the laid down principles of the organization. We also have an extensive footprint in country through our local networks. And we really do rely on our local networks to build that very much country level membership, where the principles of the UN Global Compact and the Sustainable Development Goals are articulated and implemented. I think it's very important for members to see this as an opportunity to grow their business sustainably and rebuild. We certainly rely on networks to be able to advise on where there are transgressors or reports to be able to highlight that. But I totally agree with you. It is not possible to identify everything that is going on within the business sector, but we believe that our local networks play a central part. Another really important bit of our work is really building and fostering a very strong partnerships. No one entity is going to build a cohesive and sustainable business sector. And that's why we rely on partnerships with government, with other private sector entities, with other UN agencies to really help us galvanize this movement of business, of responsible business.
When it comes to transgressors, what kind of teeth do you have?
So we're definitely not an enforcement agency. So in instances where companies have really gone against our 10 principles, we have the leeway to expel them from our membership. We also highlight where these transgressions have happened. If they are in the area of human rights, perhaps the UN office in charge of human rights would follow that up. But for us, certainly, it's a demonstration that our membership is principle and values-based, and we therefore would like to keep our membership within those confines. But we're not an enforcement agency. We would not lay out punitive measures, but we would certainly highlight where businesses are not standing to the best of these ideals.
Now, one of the pillars of what you do is that, and correct me if I'm wrong with the figures, that 10,435 companies from 166 countries, they supply you with 70,000 compliance reports so you can check what they're doing, making sure they're not transgressing the principles that you support. Now, in these chaotic times, and we know how chaotic things can be now, how tricky is it going to be for you to monitor them and make sure they're sending you all the information that you need to know?
So one of the really good things that has happened is obviously a lot of digitization has taken place. So reports are submitted online, but we're also actually trying to work on the communication progress and make it more metric focused. At present, quite a bit of responsible business or sustainability reporting is narrative heavy, which is a great illustration of the process that is undertaken. But what really more is equally important is the outcomes and the metrics, and demonstrating that this really does add value and there's tangible results. And so then therefore the improvement on the communication of progress that we're now doing at the Compact is one of those areas that will really help us be able to review reports, analyze across, and get through this process of, as you say, going through the monumental 70,000 reports in a way that makes sense and adds value to the submitting companies as well.
And in many ways, the worst of times for Africa are yet to come. I mean, in South Africa alone, they're talking 1 million, maybe even 2 million jobs could be lost in the next few months. In the middle of all this, I mean, what are your hopes for private business in Africa in your time at the United Nations Global Compact?
So, my hopes for Africa, they remain true hopes. We were in the middle of a narrative that was themed Africa Rising. We saw a number of economies rise from traditionally low-income economies to middle-income economies. Lots of innovation coming out of the continent, continued both domestic and foreign investment. And I would like to hope that post-COVID, we are able to grow back stronger and continue on that narrative. Pleased to note the efforts made by the Africa Union in terms of the COVID response fund, the guidance that's been given by the Africa CDC on scientific and health policy issues, the clear call to action that countries need to really put in place strong post-COVID recovery plans. I think that the rebuilding of many countries on the African continent will begin within. It'll begin by really looking at how we can rebuild across the entire continuum of business, from the small and medium enterprises through to big business and multinationals. We'll really look at how we can look at rebuilding supply chains, how we ultimately grow our domestic investment, regional investment, and ultimately go back into international trade and cooperation. Many African countries that we know are at very different levels of this pandemic. And again, as I said, are struggling between saving lives and saving livelihoods. At the core of it, for me, I think remains really inclusive government responses, as well as an inclusive rebuild of the business sector continuum.
Now, just a little bit about yourself as well. Now, you come from a powerful family. I saw in a recent Kenyan newspaper, they called you guys the Immortals. The big front page story. Your father, Hillary, was Kenya's first black cardiologist. Your mother, Julia, was a presidential running mate in the 2007 elections and the first woman to be in the country's cabinet. Your brother's a lawyer and a jazz aficionado. Your one sister's an economist. The other one's a management trainer. There must have been a lot of competition around the dinner table in your family. Just give us an idea of the family you grew up in.
Yeah, and I really have to thank my parents for really laying the groundwork in terms of what it means to be in service to your country and in service to your community. They were amongst the pioneers to go to university abroad, because at that time our tertiary education system was not that well developed, but they always had a strong commitment to come back and serve their country. So as you mentioned, my father was the first black cardiologist, completed his training and came back to help build the Faculty of Medicine. And indeed, yes, my mother has been an active politician running in Kenyan politics. Be that as it may, when we sat at the family dinner table, we were the Ojiambo family, where parents inquired about well-being, about our careers, about our friends and the social networks that we built. I think our conversations were very much like any other family conversation around the table. What strikes me most about my parents and the values that they instilled in us is they always made it very clear that what was very important was to be able to be of service and growth and contribute, to the growth of your country and the economy. But honestly, our dinner table conversations were very much like yours, I'd like to imagine.
Anyway, it seems that also there's a report I read about your father. I'd like to ask you if it's true. Somebody read somewhere that every day he had a Bible, a rosary, and the model of a heart on his desk at work. Is that true?
Indeed, he did. Indeed, he did. He was a very, very committed cardiologist, but also very committed to his faith. And I think those two were the things that saw him through his career. Absolutely. Those are absolutely fond memories.
Okay, and also another thing I extracted from the Kenyan press is that you were brought up in, quote, I'm quoting them, by missionary parents with strict discipline. How would you describe that as a description of your family?
I actually think that our family and our parents are extremely liberal. If I speak of myself, I left the country at age 12 to go and study abroad, courtesy of support that my father had when he was working at the United Nations. And so we've pretty much grown up very independently, chosen our own career paths, as you cited from your very deep research about what my siblings are doing. And we continue to grow very independently and continue to touch base and interact as a family. So perhaps, yes, my mother was brought up by parents who were both in the church. I don't think that has played any significant role in narrowing the opportunity for us. If anything, provided a fantastic platform for growth.
Now, just a question to ask you, as in often many people here in this country, powerful people, have often lamented to me that many of the so-called missionary schools, which these days seem a bit uncool, they've disappeared, leaving a big, big hole in the education system in Africa. What is your view? I mean, do you think they should still be around and promoted? A lot of them went out of business here. A lot of them just disappeared completely.
Yeah. I think what people may be pointing to, and forgive me because I probably am generalizing here, is how you bring back values and principle-based education back into an education system. And I think that it's very important when we look at education systems whose job is really to create better citizens and future leaders. And academics certainly gives you a very strong grounding in technical subjects. Perhaps what is missing and what needs to be augmented in our learning systems is values, principles, and leadership. And I think, in pursuit of stronger academic results, many schools have cut down on a lot of the extra learnings that come across, around philosophy, religion, leadership, entrepreneurship. My position on that is that a holistic education curriculum really needs to embed both academic skills as well as life skills, values, and principles. And I think with that, we're then contributing to growing better citizens and future leaders.
So back to the job, your day job. Now, I read the speech you gave last night to the United Nations, to the great and the good, and I'm quoting your exact words here. At the end of the day, we're all united in the business of a better world. I agree, fine sentiment. But sadly, I mean, we've been covering this COVID-19 since day one here on CNBC Africa. Sadly, I fear the world is likely, and the business world is likely to be more fearful, more nationalistic, more divided in the future. What are your fears?
Yeah. So that term, we're united in the business of a better world, for me is both inspirational and aspirational. I think it's something that we need to continue to look forward to and articulate if we are to see the better times that we know will exist beyond COVID-19. What I'm afraid of is an inability perhaps to balance the needs of fragile health systems and declining economic activity. And I think it's a delicate balance that many governments need to make very careful decisions around. Our president here, President Kenyatta articulated that about 2 weeks ago when he spoke to the nation then. I think there's also the need for increased, collaboration across sectors. Again, no one entity will solve the COVID crisis alone. So government needs to work closer with business, with civil society, with the health profession, and have a unified solution and approach to this all. So truly, I mean, my fears are that the economic recovery may be delayed, maybe not as inclusive as possible, and we may not be able to rebuild in the ways that we should. What I'm grateful for is that there is, signs of post-COVID recovery that is coming up in a couple of countries across the world. There's certainly now better reporting, better statistics, better forecasting. So in a way, we benefit here on our continent with a little bit of benefit of hindsight and seeing what other countries have had to go through, how they need to prepare, and what sort of discussions and policy decisions they need to make.
What about the health systems of Africa? I've been listening into these World Health Organization briefings for months now since COVID-19 started. And I've seen how the more testing's been going, more laboratories have been set up. That's the good side. But the downside is that I get this overall feeling that this whole system, health system from Lagos to Johannesburg to Nairobi is still going to struggle to contain this COVID-19. What's your view?
And I agree with you. Again, I'm hesitant to generalize for across the continent, but I certainly know that already health systems were challenged. Having an all-inclusive health system that provides quality, affordable, and accessible healthcare is not a reality for many countries on the continent. It is, arguably the case that we have well-equipped private sector health provision, but to some extent that is not affordable to the vast majority of the population. We're at the process of discussing things such as universal health coverage, but the COVID pandemic has now essentially rebalanced really where a lot of resources were going. So again, it is important to look at how health sectors can build back post-COVID, be able to provide the broad range of health services that is required at quality, at scale, and affordable and accessible. So that is a huge challenge, I think, for very many countries.
And we're getting towards the end of the interview here now, and perhaps we should talk a little bit more hope after talking about job losses and some of the struggles with the health system. What hope do you have? I mean, during the Depression in the 1930s, there were some great entrepreneurs, some of the worldwide names that grew up in shipping, manufacture, construction. What are your hopes for entrepreneurs in Africa in these difficult times?
Right. So I think for entrepreneurs, my hopes would be that we collectively have been able to see the opportunities that lie with the fact that, for a couple of months now, essentially trade and import has stopped. The question, if I was an entrepreneur, I would ask, what is it? What opportunities can I now seize and look at finding new opportunities for business, for manufacturing, for agriculture, for many different areas, and just look at how we can again spur both domestic production, domestic manufacturing, and ultimately domestic consumption. I think the fragility of the supply chains during this period has opened up lots of opportunities if one is able to seize. The reality is, though, for many small entrepreneurs, they're locked out of credit systems, they're not able to access loans. And so I think it also behooves the banking sectors to take a little bit more of a flexible approach to credit scoring, to credit rating, to advancing credit to small and medium-scale entrepreneurs, because they certainly will need the leg up to be able to kick off in these unprecedented times. But what we've certainly seen is that in spite of perhaps a slowdown in government spending, there is still ongoing consumer spending, and certainly for the most basic of items, great opportunity for local entrepreneurs to innovate around.
And just one last personal question. I also read that you said the late Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, was one of your role models, whatever you want to call him. What do you want to do in this job for Africa to pay tribute to him?
Yeah. So Kofi Annan's vision, as he articulated when he was founding the Compact, was that business would certainly play a role in uniting humanity. I'm born and bred on the continent. I am a firm believer in driving Africa's economic development forward. For me, I think first would be a stronger recognition and adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 10 principles. I would be most pleased if the SDGs and the principles were incorporated in a lot more corporate strategies, were more of the parlance in SMEs and all business sectors around the world and around the continent, if African business leaders would be strong advocates for sustainable development and the principles, and that African governments too would incorporate more of the SDGs and the 10 principles in their overall macroeconomic projects. I think at a different and a lower level, more cooperation.
I'm afraid, I think at the end of a very, very enjoyable interview there, I'm afraid that the signal let us down. That was Sanda Ojiambo, the CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. She's the first African to run a UN agency, and today is her first day at work. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on the CNBC Africa special. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.